They say nothing ever happens in small towns. That behind those white picket fences and friendly waves, life moves at a peaceful pace where the biggest scandal is who's dating whom, and the most dangerous thing you'll encounter is a traffic jam at the local diner. Tonight, we're going to shatter that illusion completely. What you're about to hear are 11 documented cases that will make you question everything you thought you knew about quiet communities across America. So dim the lights, lock your doors, and prepare yourself for 11 true tales that will forever change how you see those peaceful small towns you drive through. Because after tonight, you'll know the terrifying truth. The quieter the town, the louder the screams that echo in its shadows. This is Verified Fears, and viewer discretion is strongly advised. Let's move to our first story. Our journey begins in Millbrook, Vermont. Population 847, where maple trees line Main Street. And the biggest excitement usually comes from the annual Harvest Festival. It's the kind of place where people still leave their doors unlocked and wave to strangers passing through. Elena Hartwell had lived there her entire life. 34 years of predictable routines and familiar faces. As the town's head librarian, she knew everyone's reading habits, their children's names, and their family histories going back generations. Elena thought she knew everything about her quiet little world. She was wrong. Elena lived alone in a 2-story colonial house that had belonged to her grandmother. White clapboard siding, green shutters, and a wraparound porch that creaked pleasantly in the evening breeze. She'd inherited it 5 years earlier and had grown comfortable with its familiar noises. The settling of old wood, the whisper of wind through the eaves, the occasional scurry of mice in the walls. But in late September, she began hearing something different. Footsteps. Soft, deliberate footsteps coming from directly above her bedroom ceiling. At first, Elena rationalized it away. Old houses make strange sounds, especially as temperatures drop and wood contracts. Maybe it was squirrels that had found their way into the attic space. She dealt with that before. But these weren't the quick scratching movements of small animals. These were the measured, careful steps of something much larger, something that seemed to move with purpose. The footsteps followed a pattern. They began around midnight, always starting at the same spot directly above her bed, then moving slowly across the ceiling toward the front of the house. Elena would lie awake, her heart hammering against her ribs, tracking the sound as it made its deliberate journey overhead. The steps would pause at certain points, as if whatever was up there was listening, waiting. Then they would resume, completing their circuit before falling silent again. This happened every night for 2 weeks. Elena's rational mind fought against the growing dread. She told herself it had to be the house settling, or perhaps pipes expanding and contracting. But deep down in that primitive part of her brain that had kept her ancestors alive, she knew better. Those were footsteps, human footsteps. Someone was in her attic. The realization should have sent her running to the police. But Elena found herself paralyzed by a different kind of fear. The fear of being wrong, of seeming foolish. Millbrook was a small town where gossip traveled faster than wildfire. If she called Sheriff Morrison claiming someone was living in her attic and turned out to be mistaken, she'd never live it down. The librarian, who lost her mind and heard imaginary intruders. So instead, she suffered in silence, night after night, listening to those methodical footsteps above her head. The sounds began to change her. Elena, who had always been punctual and organized, started making mistakes at work. She'd lose track of conversations, mid-sentence, forget to return the books to their proper shelves, and jump at the slightest unexpected noise. Her assistant, Margaret, noticed the dark circles under her eyes and asked if she was feeling all right. Elena forced a smile and blamed it on seasonal allergies. But Margaret's concerned expression suggested she wasn't entirely convinced. 3 weeks into her ordeal, Elena discovered something that made her blood run cold. She was in her bedroom gathering laundry when she noticed a small piece of ceiling plaster on her pillow. Looking up, She saw a hairline crack in the plaster directly above where she slept. The crack was new, and it was growing. Whatever was up there was heavy enough to stress the old ceiling joists. That night, Elena couldn't bring herself to sleep in her bedroom. She made a bed on the living room couch, but even there, she could hear the footsteps beginning their nightly journey overhead. Only now, they seemed different, more agitated, as if whatever was up there knew she wasn't in her usual place and was searching for her. The breaking point came on a Thursday night in October. Elena had been lying on the couch, staring at the ceiling and listening to the now familiar pattern of footsteps when she heard something new, a soft thud followed by what sounded unmistakably like a human sigh, not the whistle of wind through gaps in the roof, but an actual weary sigh, the sound of someone who was tired, frustrated, or perhaps disappointed. Elena's paralysis shattered. She grabbed her phone and called 911, her voice shaking as she explained the situation to the dispatcher. Sheriff Morrison arrived 20 minutes later with Deputy Collins, both men wearing expressions of polite skepticism that Elena had seen countless times in her small town. The look people gave when they thought you were overreacting, but were too polite to say so directly. "Now, Elena," Sheriff Morrison said in his gentle, patronizing tone. "You know, these old houses make all kinds of sounds. My place cacks and groans like a ship in a storm." But Elena insisted, and eventually the two officers agreed to check the attic. They pulled down the access ladder in the hallway ceiling, and Sheriff Morrison climbed up with his flashlight while Deputy Collins waited below. Elena stood in the doorway, her heart pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. The silence stretched for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. Then Sheriff Morrison's voice drifted down from the darkness above, tight with shock and something that might have been fear. "Collins, you need to get up here now." What they found in Elena's attic would haunt the small town of Millbrook for years to come. Someone had been living up there for months, possibly since early summer. They'd created a nest of sorts in the far corner. Blankets, pillows, and personal items arranged in a makeshift living space. Empty food containers, water bottles, and even a portable camping toilet showed that whoever had been there had planned for an extended stay. But it was the other items that made Sheriff Morrison's hands shake as he cataloged them. Dozens of photographs of Elena taken through her windows at all hours of the day and night. Pictures of her sleeping, showering, eating dinner, reading in her favorite chair. The photos were arranged in careful chronological order, documenting her daily routines with obsessive precision. There were notebooks filled with detailed observations about her habits, her schedule, her visitors. The handwriting was neat, methodical, and deeply disturbing in its clinical detachment. The most chilling discovery was a collection of Elena's personal items that had gone missing over the months. A hairbrush, underwear from her laundry line, a coffee mug she'd thought she'd simply misplaced. These items were arranged almost like a shrine, suggesting a level of obsession that went far beyond simple voyeurism. They never found who had been living in Elena's attic. The investigation revealed that access had been gained through a loose board in the roof that could be moved from the outside, allowing someone to slip in and out undetected. Fingerprints found at the scene didn't match anyone in the system. And despite interviewing everyone in town, no one had seen anything suspicious. Elena moved out of the house the next day and never returned. She left Millbrook entirely, taking a job at a library in Burlington, where she could disappear into anonymity. The house stood empty for 2 years before finally being sold to a family from out of state who had no knowledge of what had happened there. But the story didn't end with Elena's departure. 6 months later, Deputy Collins was called to investigate a similar case on the other side of town. An elderly woman named Mrs. Patterson had been hearing footsteps in her attic. This time, they found evidence that someone had been living there, too, along with the same type of obsessive documentation and stolen personal items. The pattern repeated itself 3 more times over the next year. Each time, the victims were women living alone, Each time, the intruder had gained access through the roof and had been watching, documenting, and stealing personal items for months before being discovered. And each time, by the time the police arrived, the perpetrator had vanished without a trace. Sheriff Morrison retired early, claiming the stress of the unsolved cases had taken its toll on his health. Deputy Collins took over, but the investigation went nowhere. The FBI was called in, but even they couldn't find any leads. Whoever was terrorizing the women of Millbrook seemed to know the town better than its own residents, always staying one step ahead of law enforcement. Elena never spoke publicly about her experience, but those who knew her before said she was never the same. The confident, outgoing librarian who had known everyone in town became a nervous, paranoid woman who checked locks obsessively and couldn't sleep without medication. She'd learned the terrifying truth that safety is just an illusion, and that even in the smallest, quietest towns, evil can be watching from the shadows, waiting for the perfect moment to reveal itself. The case remains unsolved to this day, and the people of Millbrook still lock their doors at night, still glance nervously at their ceilings when they hear unexplained sounds, and still wonder if somewhere in their quiet little town, someone is watching, waiting, and planning their next move. But Elena's nightmare was just beginning, compared to what happened 200 meters away in Cedar Falls, Iowa, where an entire family would vanish without a trace, leaving behind only questions that still haunt investigators today. Let's move to our second story. Cedar Falls, Iowa, sits nestled in the heart of America's farmland, where cornfields stretch to the horizon, and the biggest news usually involves high school football scores or the annual county fair. Population 2,341, where 3 generations of families have lived side by side, where everyone knows their neighbor's business, and where mysteries simply don't exist. At least, that's what Marcus Chen believed when he took the job as the sole reporter for the Cedar Falls Gazette in the spring of 2019. Fresh out of journalism school, Marcus thought he'd spend his time covering city council meetings and church bake sales. He never imagined he'd stumble into a case that would challenge everything he understood about reality itself. Marcus had been on the job for exactly 6 months when the call came in on a crisp October morning. Mrs. Delilah Brennan, the town's unofficial neighborhood watch coordinator, was on the line, her voice tight with worry. The Kowalski family hadn't been seen for 3 days. Their mail was piling up. Their car was still in the driveway. And most concerning of all, their dog had been barking nonstop since Tuesday night in a town where people noticed if you were 5 minutes late to church. 3 days of silence from a family of 4 was unprecedented. Marcus drove to the Kowalski house on Maple Street, expecting to find a simple explanation. Maybe they'd gone to visit relatives and forgotten to arrange for mail pickup. Perhaps there was a family emergency that had required a sudden departure. But as he pulled up to the modest 2-story home with its perfectly manicured lawn and cheerful yellow shutters, something felt wrong. The newspapers weren't just piling up. They were scattered across the front porch, as if they'd been thrown there carelessly. The dog, a golden retriever named Buddy, was in the backyard barking with the desperate intensity of an animal in distress. Sheriff Patricia Valdez arrived just as Marcus was taking notes. A no-nonsense woman in her 50s who'd been keeping the peace in Cedar Falls for over 2 decades. She approached the situation with professional skepticism. The Kowalskis, Robert, 45, his wife Jennifer, 42, and their twin daughters, Sarah and Emma, both 16, were known as a stable, predictable family. Robert worked at the grain elevator. Jennifer taught 3rd grade at the elementary school, and the twins were honor students who'd never caused a moment's trouble. They weren't the type to disappear without warning. Sheriff Valdez knocked on the front door, calling out official announcements, while Marcus watched from the sidewalk. When no one answered, she tried the door handle. It was locked. They walked around the house, checking windows and the back door. Everything was secure, exactly as it should be. But through the kitchen window, Marcus could see something that made his stomach clench with unease. The table was set for dinner. 4 plates, 4 glasses, 4 sets of silverware, arranged with Jennifer's characteristic precision. Steam was still rising from what appeared to be a pot of soup on the stove. The food was still warm. In a house where no one had been seen for 3 days, dinner was still warm. Sheriff Valdez called for backup and a locksmith. Within an hour, they had legal entry to the house, and what they found inside defied all logical explanation. The soup on the stove was indeed warm, as if it had been prepared within the last hour. The bread on the counter was fresh, still soft to the touch. Milk in the refrigerator hadn't expired, and the newspaper on the kitchen counter was dated that very morning. Yet, no one had seen any member of the Kowalski family since Tuesday. Marcus followed the sheriff through the house, documenting everything with growing bewilderment. In the living room, the television was on, tuned to a program that had aired just 20 minutes earlier. Robert's coffee mug sat on his favorite chair's armrest, still containing warm coffee. Upstairs, the beds were made with military precision, but Jennifer's purse was on the dresser, her car keys beside it. The twins' backpacks were in their room, homework assignments half completed on their desks. Most disturbing of all were the personal items that suggested interrupted routine. Jennifer's reading glasses were folded on an open book, a bookmark placed precisely at page 247. Robert's work boots were by the back door, still muddy from his shift at the grain elevator. The twins' phones were charging on their nightstands, showing dozens of missed calls and texts from worried friends. Everything indicated a family that had simply vanished mid-activity, as if they'd been plucked from existence without warning. Sheriff Valdez called in the state police, who arrived with a forensics team and a growing sense of unease. They dusted for fingerprints, finding only those belonging to the family members. They searched for signs of struggle, finding none. They interviewed neighbors who all told the same story. They'd seen the family Tuesday evening going about their normal routines, and then nothing. No screams, no sounds of disturbance, no vehicles coming or going in the night. Marcus spent the next week diving deeper into the mystery, interviewing everyone who'd had contact with the Kowalskis in their final days. Robert's supervisor at the grain elevator said he'd been his usual reliable self, showing up on time and completing his work without complaint. Jennifer's principal reported that she'd been planning lessons for the following week and had seemed perfectly normal. The twins' teacher said they'd been in class Tuesday, participating in discussions and turning in assignments. The investigation expanded to include the family's financial records, phone records, and social media activity. Nothing suggested any reason for them to disappear voluntarily. Their bank accounts were untouched, their credit cards unused since Tuesday. Their last phone calls were routine. Jennifer had spoken to her sister about weekend plans. Robert had called his doctor to reschedule an appointment, and the twins had texted friends about homework assignments. As days turned into weeks, the case attracted national attention. The FBI sent agents to Cedar Falls, bringing sophisticated equipment and expertise in missing persons cases. They set up a command center in the high school gymnasium and conducted exhaustive searches of the surrounding farmland. Volunteers from neighboring towns joined the effort, combing through cornfields, wooded areas with trained search dogs. They found nothing. The media descended on Cedar Falls like locusts, transforming the quiet town into a circus of news vans and reporters. Marcus found himself thrust into the spotlight as the local journalist who'd been first on the scene. He gave interviews to national networks, always emphasizing the same baffling details: the warm food, the fresh coffee, the interrupted routines that suggested the family had vanished in the middle of their normal evening. Theories proliferated wildly. Some suggested alien abduction, pointing to the lack of physical evidence and the seemingly impossible circumstances. Others proposed witness protection, speculating that the family had been relocated by federal authorities for reasons unknown. The most disturbing theory, whispered in coffee shops and church basement, was that something supernatural had occurred, that Cedar Falls had been touched by forces beyond human understanding. Marcus investigated every lead, no matter how far-fetched. He interviewed UFO researchers, federal agents, and paranormal investigators. He studied similar cases from around the fire country, finding a handful of incidents that shared some characteristics, but none that matched the Kowalski disappearance exactly. The warm food remained the detail that stumped everyone. How could a family vanish for days while their dinner stayed fresh? 6 months after the disappearance, the FBI scaled back their investigation. The case remained open, but active searching ceased. The Kowalski house stood empty, a shrine to an unsolved mystery that had shaken the foundations of a community that thought it knew everything about itself. Marcus continued his reporting, but the story had evolved from breaking news to cold case. From urgent investigation to haunting reminder, the psychological impact on Cedar Falls was profound. People who'd never locked their doors began installing security systems. Parents who'd allowed their children to walk to school alone started driving them. The comfortable certainty that had defined small-town life evaporated, replaced by the unsettling knowledge that sometimes people simply vanish without explanation. Marcus never stopped investigating. He kept files on every detail, every interview, every theory. He corresponded with other journalists covering similar cases, building a network of people obsessed with the inexplicable. But as years passed, he began to accept that some mysteries might never be solved, that some questions might never have answers. The Kowalski case changed Marcus from an optimistic young reporter into a man haunted by the limits of human understanding. He'd learned that in small towns where everyone knows everyone, the most terrifying truth is that sometimes knowing everyone means nothing at all. People can vanish from locked houses, leaving behind warm meals and unanswered questions that echo through the years, like whispers in an empty room. The house on Maple Street eventually sold to a family from out of state, but they moved out after 6 months, claiming they felt watched. It's been empty ever since. A monument to the day Cedar Falls learned that safety is an illusion, and that even in the heart of America, reality itself can disappear without warning. While Marcus searched for answers that would never come, 200 miles away in Harmony, Ohio, a 2-year-old girl named Rebecca Thompson was about to experience a night that would haunt her for the rest of her life. Let's move to our third story. Harmony, Ohio, was the kind of place where childhood felt eternal and innocent, where summer nights stretched endlessly. The biggest worry was whether you'd finished your homework before Monday morning. Population 1,847, nestled between rolling hills and family farms, where generations of children had grown up riding bikes on tree-lined streets and playing hide-and-seek until their mothers called them home for dinner. It was here that 2-year-old Rebecca Thompson learned that some childhood memories are too dark to ever truly forget. Rebecca was an ordinary girl in an ordinary town, the kind of kid who collected stickers, loved horses, and dreamed of becoming a veterinarian when she grew up. She had sandy brown hair that her mother insisted on keeping in neat braids, freckles across her nose that darkened every summer, and the infectious laugh that made her popular among her classmates. In the spring of 1987, she was invited to what should have been the highlight of her 6th grade year, a sleepover at the home of Melissa Crawford, the most popular girl in their class. Melissa lived in one of Harmony's nicest neighborhoods, where the houses were larger and the lawns more manicured than in Rebecca's modest subdivision. The Crawford house was a sprawling ranch-style home with a finished basement that had become the unofficial headquarters for sleepovers among the popular girls. Mrs. Crawford was known as the cool mom, who let the girls stay up late, eat junk food, and watch movies that were probably too mature for their age. For Rebecca, who rarely got invited to such exclusive gatherings, the invitation felt like acceptance into a world she'd always observed from the outside. The sleepover was planned for Saturday night, and Rebecca spent the entire week preparing. She bought new pajamas with her allowance money, practiced doing her hair in the style she'd seen in teen magazines, and carefully selected which stuffed animal to bring without seeming too childish. Her mother, Linda, was thrilled that Rebecca was finally being included by the popular crowd and drove her to the Crawford house with a smile and instructions to have fun and be good. The evening started perfectly. 6 girls had been invited: Rebecca, Melissa, Katie Walsh, Amanda Foster, Jennifer Mills, and Sarah Hendress. They painted each other's nails, shared gossip about boys in their class, and ate pizza while watching movies in the basement. Mrs. Crawford checked on them periodically, bringing snacks and reminding them not to stay up too late, though her wink suggested she didn't really mean it. For Rebecca, it felt like the best night of her life. She was finally part of the group, finally accepted by the girls she'd admired from afar. As the night wore on, the conversation turned to more serious topics. The girls talked about their fears, their crushes, and their dreams for high school. Rebecca found herself opening up in ways she never had before, sharing stories about her family and her insecurities. The other girls seemed genuinely interested, asking questions and offering support. For the first time in her life, Rebecca felt like she truly belonged somewhere. Around midnight, Mrs. Crawford came downstairs one final time to remind them to get some sleep. The girls promised they would, but as soon as they heard her bedroom door close upstairs, they began planning their real adventure. Melissa had heard about an old, abandoned house on the outskirts of town, a place that local teenagers claimed was haunted. The idea of sneaking out to explore it seemed like the perfect way to cement their friendship and create a memory they'd share forever. Rebecca felt a flutter of anxiety in her stomach. She'd never snuck out before, never disobeyed her parents in such a direct way. But the other girls were so excited, so confident that it would be fun and harmless. She didn't want to be the one to ruin the adventure, the one who proved she didn't really belong in their group after all. So when they quietly gathered their shoes and jackets, Rebecca followed along, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and excitement. The abandoned house was a 20-minute walk through quiet residential streets, and then along a dirt road that led into farmland. The girls whispered and giggled as they walked, their flashlights creating dancing shadows on the ground. The spring air was cool but not cold, and the moon was bright enough to light their way. Rebecca began to relax, caught up in the adventure and the camaraderie of shared rebellion. The house, when they finally reached it, was more decrepit than any of them had expected. It was a 2-story farmhouse that had clearly been abandoned for years, with broken windows, sagging porch steps, and paint peeling from its weathered siding. Weeds had grown up around the foundation, and the front door hung slightly ajar, creaking softly in the night breeze. The girls stood at the edge of the overgrown yard, suddenly less certain about their plan. It was Melissa who broke the spell of hesitation, declaring that they'd come too far to turn back now. She marched up to the front door with exaggerated bravery, the other girls following reluctantly behind. The door opened with a groan that seemed unnaturally loud in the quiet night, and they stepped into a house that smelled of mold, decay, and something else, something sweet and sickly that made Rebecca's stomach turn. They explored the first floor with their flashlights, finding rooms filled with abandoned furniture covered in dust and cobwebs. The kitchen still had dishes in the sink, as if the previous occupants had simply walked away in the middle of a meal. Upstairs, they found bedrooms with clothes still hanging in the closets and family photographs on the dressers, their faces obscured by years of dust and neglect. It was in the master bedroom that they found the first sign that they weren't alone. Sarah noticed it first. A sleeping bag, spread out on the floor in the corner, with what appeared to be recent food wrappers scattered around it. The sleeping bag was clean, newer than anything else in the house, and it was positioned in a way that provided a clear view of the bedroom door. Someone had been staying here, and recently the girls huddled together, whispering urgently about what they should do. Rebecca wanted to leave immediately, every instinct screaming that they were in danger, but Melissa insisted it was probably just a homeless person who wouldn't hurt anyone, and the others seemed torn between fear and curiosity. They decided to explore a little more to see if they could find any other signs of recent habitation. They never got the chance. As they were examining the sleeping bag more closely, they heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps on the stairs, heavy, deliberate footsteps that were definitely not made by any of them. The girls froze, their flashlights creating a circle of light in the darkness as they stared at the bedroom doorway. A man appeared in the doorway, silhouetted against the dim light from the hallway. He was tall and thin, wearing dark clothes that made him blend into the shadows. His face was obscured, but Rebecca could see enough to know that he was smiling. A cold, predatory smile that made her blood freeze in her veins. He didn't say anything at first, just stood there, watching them with an intensity that felt like physical weight. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft and conversational, as if he were greeting old friends rather than confronting 6 terrified 1-2-year-old girls in an abandoned house in the middle of the night. He told them not to be afraid, that he'd been watching them explore his house and was impressed by their bravery. He said he'd been lonely and was happy to have visitors, especially such pretty young visitors. The girls pressed together in the corner, their earlier bravado completely evaporated. Rebecca felt Jennifer's hand grip hers, so tightly it hurt, and she could hear Amanda crying softly. The man stepped into the room, moving slowly and deliberately, like a predator who knew his prey had nowhere to run. What happened next would haunt Rebecca for the rest of her life. The man began talking to them in that same soft, friendly voice, asking their names and ages, complimenting their hair and their clothes. He seemed particularly interested in Rebecca, commenting on her freckles when asking if she was the shy one of the group. His attention felt like ice water in her veins, and she found herself unable to speak or move. The man told them he had a game they could play, something fun that would help them relax and not be so scared. He reached into his pocket and pulled out what looked like rope, explaining that the game involved taking turns being tied up while the others tried to escape. He made it sound innocent, playful, but Rebecca could see the predatory gleam in his eyes and knew with absolute certainty that this was no game. It was Katie who broke the spell of terror that had frozen them all. She suddenly screamed at the top of her lungs and bolted for the door, pushing past the man with desperate strength. Her screams seemed to wake the others from their paralysis, and they all ran, pushing and stumbling in their panic to escape the room. The man didn't chase them immediately, and Rebecca would later wonder if he'd been so confident in his control over the situation that their sudden flight caught him off guard. The girls ran through the house, crashing into furniture and walls in their desperation to reach the front door. Rebecca could hear him behind them now, his footsteps, heavy and purposeful. No longer the careful stalking movements of before. They burst out of the house and ran into the night, their screams echoing across the empty farmland. Rebecca ran harder than she'd ever run in her life, her lungs burning and her legs shaking with exhaustion and terror. She could hear the others around her, their panicked breathing and sobbing, creating a soundtrack of horror that would replay in her nightmares for years to come. They didn't stop running until they reached the main road, where they collapsed in a heap, gasping and crying. It was only then that Rebecca realized something that made her blood run cold all over again. There were only 5 of them. Sarah Hriss was missing. The girls ran back to the Crawford house where they woke Mrs. Crawford and called the police. Within minutes, the house was filled with officers, paramedics, and Rebecca's parents who had been called. When the police realized the severity of the situation, the girls were questioned separately, their stories corroborating each other in all the important details. A massive search was launched immediately. Police cars, search dogs, and volunteers combed the area around the abandoned house, but they found no trace of Sarah or the man who had been living there. The sleeping bag was gone, along with any other evidence of recent habitation. It was as if the man had simply vanished, taking Sarah with him. Sarah's body was found 3 days later in a drainage ditch 5 miles from the abandoned house. She had been sexually assaulted and strangled, her small body discarded like trash on the side of a country road. The man was never found, despite an extensive investigation that involved state police and FBI agents. The case remained open, but as years passed with no new leads, it gradually faded from active investigation. Rebecca never spoke publicly about that night, but those who knew her said she was never the same. The outgoing, laughing girl who had been so excited about the sleepover became withdrawn and anxious, jumping at unexpected sounds and refusing to sleep anywhere but her own bedroom. She underwent years of therapy, but the trauma of that night had carved itself so deeply into her psyche that it became part of who she was. The other surviving girls dealt with their trauma in different ways, but none of them escaped unscathed. Katie moved away with her family the following year. Amanda developed severe anxiety that required medication. Jennifer became obsessively focused on her studies, as if academic achievement could somehow protect her from the randomness of evil. Melissa, the popular girl who had organized the sleepover, blamed herself for Sarah's death and struggled with depression throughout her teenage years. Rebecca grew up to become a social worker, dedicating her life to helping other children who had experienced trauma. She never married, never had children of her own. As if the events of that night had frozen her in a state of perpetual childhood fear, she still lived in Harmony, though she avoided the part of town where the abandoned house had stood before it was finally demolished years later. The case of Sarah Riss remained one of Harmony's darkest mysteries, a reminder that evil could strike anywhere, even in the safest of small towns. Parents became more protective, sleepovers became more supervised, and the innocent freedom that had defined childhood in places like Harmony began to erode. Rebecca never spoke of that night again until she heard about what happened to David Rodriguez in Pinewood, Oregon, where a friendly neighbor's smile hid secrets that would make even her nightmare seem tame by comparison. Let's move to our fourth story. Pinewood, Oregon, was the kind of suburban paradise that real estate agents dream about. Tree-lined streets with names like Maple Grove and Cedar Lane, where every house had a 2-car garage and a perfectly manicured lawn. Population 8,432, where the biggest controversy was usually about homeowners association rules, and the most exciting event was the annual block party. It was here that David Rodriguez learned that the most dangerous predators are often the ones who wave at you from across the fence every morning. David had moved to Pinewood in the fall of 2018, seeking exactly what the town promised: safety, community, and a quiet place to raise his 2 young daughters after his divorce. At 41, he was starting over, working as an accountant for a mid-sized firm in Portland, while commuting 40 minutes each way to give his girls the suburban childhood he'd never had. The house on Burwood Avenue was perfect, a modest colonial with a fenced backyard where 8-year-old Sophia and 6-year-old Isabella could play safely while he worked from his home office. The neighborhood welcomed him with a kind of enthusiasm that made David believe he'd made the right choice. Casseroles appeared on his doorstep during the first week, along with invitations to barbecues and offers to help with anything he might need. His next-door neighbor, Walter Kemp, was particularly friendly, a retired postal worker in his 60 seconds, who seemed to have endless time for conversation and an encyclopedic knowledge of everyone on the street. Walter was exactly what central casting would order for the role of perfect neighbor. He was a soft-spoken man with silver hair and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, always dressed in cardigans and pressed slacks that gave him the appearance of a favorite grandfather. He tended a beautiful garden that was the envy of the neighborhood, and he was always willing to lend tools or offer advice about home maintenance. When David mentioned struggling with his sprinkler system, Walter spent an entire Saturday helping him fix it, refusing any payment and insisting that neighbors help neighbors. The friendship developed naturally over the months that followed. Walter would often be working in his garden when David returned from work, and they'd chat over the fence about everything from local politics to the best restaurants in town. Walter seemed genuinely interested in David's life, asking about his job, his daughters, and his adjustment to single parenthood. He offered to watch the girls if David ever needed a babysitter, and he always had a friendly wave and a smile when they encountered each other around the neighborhood. David's daughters adored Walter, who they called Mr. Walt. He would give them flowers from his garden and always had peppermints in his pocket for them. When Sophia lost a tooth, Walter told her elaborate stories about the tooth fairy that had her giggling for hours. When Isabella scraped her knee falling off her bike, Walter was there with band-aids and gentle words that dried her tears. He seemed like the grandfather figure the girls had been missing since the divorce. The first sign that something might be wrong came in the spring of 2019. When David noticed Walter paying unusual attention to his mail, it started innocuously enough. Walter would be in his garden when the mail carrier arrived, and he'd make casual conversation about packages or letters David had received. But gradually, David began to notice that Walter seemed to know more about his correspondence than a neighbor should. He'd ask about bills David hadn't mentioned receiving or comment on packages that had been delivered when Walter supposedly wasn't home. David initially dismissed his growing unease as paranoia brought on by the stress of single parenthood and his demanding job. Walter was just a friendly neighbor who happened to be observant, but the feeling persisted, growing stronger when David realized that Walter always seemed to know when he was going to be away from home. If David mentioned a business trip or weekend visit to his ex-wife, Walter would casually bring up the topic days later, asking how it had gone and commenting on how quiet the house had been while he was away. The turning point came on a Thursday evening in June, when David returned home from work to find his daughters playing in the backyard while Walter worked in his garden. Nothing seemed unusual at first, but as David watched from his kitchen window, he noticed something that made his blood run cold. Walter wasn't actually gardening. He was watching his daughters with an intensity that seemed far from grandfatherly. His eyes followed their every movement, and there was something in his expression that David had never seen before, something predatory and calculating. That night, David couldn't sleep. He found himself getting up repeatedly to check on his daughters, making sure their bedroom windows were locked and their curtains were drawn. He told himself he was overreacting, that Walter was just a lonely old man who enjoyed watching children play. But deep in his gut, every parental instinct was screaming that something was wrong. David began paying closer attention to Walter's behavior, and what he discovered made him sick with fear. Walter's daily routine seemed to revolve around David's family's schedule. He would appear in his garden precisely when the girls came home from school, always finding reasons to be outside when they were playing in the backyard. He'd position himself to have clear sight lines into their house, and David began to notice that Walter's bedroom window faced directly into the girls' room. The investigation that followed was something David had to conduct carefully and quietly. He couldn't simply accuse his neighbor of being a predator without evidence, especially in a tight-knit community where Walter was well-liked and respected. David began documenting Walter's behavior, taking photos of him watching the house and keeping a log of his activities. He also started researching Walter's background, using his accounting skills to dig into public records and online databases. What David found made him physically ill. Walter Kemp wasn't the retired postal worker he claimed to be. His real name was Walter Kemper, and he was a registered sex offender who had been convicted of child molestation in California 15 years earlier. He had served 8 years in prison before being released on parole, after which he had apparently changed his name and moved to Oregon to start over. The friendly neighbor who had been giving his daughters candy and flowers was a convicted pedophile who had been watching them for months. David's first instinct was to call the police immediately, but when he contacted the local authorities, he discovered the limitations of the sex offender registry system. Walter had completed his parole and was not required to register in Oregon because his conviction predated the state's registration requirements. Technically, he wasn't breaking any laws by living in the neighborhood, even though he had clearly lied about his identity and background. The police took David's concerns seriously, but they explained that without evidence of actual criminal behavior, there was little they could do beyond conducting a welfare check. They promised to increase patrols in the neighborhood and advised David to document any suspicious activity, but they couldn't arrest Walter simply for being a convicted sex offender who had changed his name. David faced an impossible choice. He could confront Walter directly, but that might escalate the situation and put his daughters in greater danger. He could move immediately, but that would mean uprooting his children from their school and friends without being able to explain why. He could warn the other neighbors, but without concrete evidence of current wrongdoing, he risked being seen as a paranoid troublemaker. The decision was made for him when David discovered that Walter had been entering his house while they were away. David had installed a security system after learning Walter's true identity, and the cameras revealed that Walter had been using a key to enter through the back door during the day when David was at work and the girls were at school. The footage showed Walter moving through the house with disturbing familiarity, spending time in the girls' bedroom and going through their belongings. The most horrifying discovery was what Walter had been doing during these unauthorized visits. The security footage showed him taking photographs of the girls' room, their clothes, and their personal items. He had been stealing small items, a hair ribbon here, a sock there, things that wouldn't be missed, but that clearly held significance for him. Most disturbing of all, the cameras captured him lying on the girls' beds, holding their stuffed animals and inhaling their scent. This time, the police had enough evidence to act. Walter was arrested on charges of burglary and stalking, and a search of his house revealed a collection of photographs and stolen items that painted a picture of obsession that had been building for months. The investigation also uncovered evidence that David's family wasn't Walter's first target. There were photographs and items belonging to other children in the neighborhood, suggesting a pattern of predatory behavior that had been going on since he'd moved to Pinewood. The arrest sent shockwaves through the community. Parents who had trusted Walter with their children, who had allowed him to babysit and give gifts, were forced to confront the possibility that their trust had been misplaced. Several families reported that their children had mentioned Walter asking inappropriate questions or making them feel uncomfortable, details that had seemed innocent at the time, but now took on sinister significance. David moved his family out of Pinewood within a month of Walter's arrest. Unable to bear living in a place where his children had been stalked and violated, the house on Burwood Avenue sat empty for months before finally selling to a family who had no knowledge of what had happened there. David never spoke publicly about the experience, but those who knew him said it had changed him fundamentally, transforming him from a trusting, suburban father into a man who saw potential threats everywhere. Walter Keir was eventually sentenced to 12 years in prison for his crimes, but the damage to the Pinewood community was irreversible. The neighborhood's sense of safety and trust had been shattered, replaced by suspicion and fear. Parents began conducting background checks on neighbors, and the casual friendliness that had defined the community gave way to careful distance and watchful eyes. David's experience became a cautionary tale about the limitations of the sex offender registry system and the ease with which predators can reinvent themselves in new communities. It was a reminder that evil doesn't always announce itself with obvious warning signs. Sometimes it comes with a friendly smile, a helping hand, and a pocket full of peppermints for the children next door. The case also highlighted the vulnerability of single parents and the predators who specifically target them, seeing them as easier marks than two-parent households. David had thought he was protecting his daughters by moving to a safe suburban neighborhood, but he had unknowingly placed them directly in the path of a predator who had been waiting for exactly the kind of opportunity they represented. David thought he'd seen the worst that humanity had to offer, but nothing prepared him for the story that would emerge from Riverside, Montana, where a trusted authority figure would prove that sometimes the people we're taught to trust with our children are the ones we should fear most. Let's move to our fifth story. Riverside, Montana, was the kind of place where high school football games drew the entire town, and where everyone knew their neighbors, children by name. Population 3,156, nestled in a valley surrounded by wheat fields and cattle ranches, where the biggest building was the high school, and the most trusted figures were teachers, coaches, and school administrators. It was here that one 6-year-old Ashley Morgan learned that the adults we're taught to trust with our deepest secrets can sometimes be the most dangerous predators of all. Ashley was a junior at Riverside High, a quiet girl with auburn hair and green eyes who preferred books to parties and spent her free time volunteering at the local animal shelter. She was the kind of student teachers loved, respectful, hardworking, and never causing trouble. Her grades were solid, if not spectacular, and she had dreams of studying veterinary medicine at Montana State University after graduation. She lived with her single mother, Carol, who worked double shifts at the local diner to make ends meet, leaving Ashley to navigate the complexities of teenage life largely on her own. The guidance counselor at Riverside High was Mr. Timothy Brennan, a man in his early 42s who had been with the school district for over a decade. He was well respected in the community, known for his dedication to helping students navigate college applications and personal problems. Mr. Brennan had a warm smile and an easy manner that made students feel comfortable opening up to him about their struggles. He was married with 2 young children of his own, coached the debate team, and was active in his church. To everyone in Riverside, he was exactly what a school counselor should be: trustworthy, caring, and completely safe. Ashley first met with Mr. Brennan during her sophomore year for routine academic planning, but their relationship deepened during her junior year when her mother was diagnosed with breast cancer. The diagnosis turned Ashley's world upside down, and she found herself struggling to maintain her grades while dealing with the fear of losing the only parent she'd ever known. Her teachers noticed her distress and recommended she speak with Mr. Brennan about her situation. The counseling sessions began innocently enough. Mr. Brennan was sympathetic and understanding, offering practical advice about managing stress and connecting Ashley with resources for families dealing with serious illness. He seemed genuinely concerned about her well-being, often asking how she was coping and encouraging her to come to his office whenever she needed someone to talk to. For Ashley, who had few close friends and no other adult confidants, these sessions became a lifeline during one of the darkest periods of her life. Mr. Brennan's office was located in a quiet corner of the school's administrative wing, away from the main hallways and classroom areas. It was decorated with motivational posters and family photos, creating an atmosphere that felt safe and professional. Ashley began visiting regularly, sometimes during lunch periods or study halls, finding comfort in having someone who seemed to understand her struggles and care about her future. Gradually, the nature of their conversations began to change. Mr. Brennan started asking more personal questions about Ashley's home life, her relationships with boys, and her feelings about her developing body. He framed these inquiries as normal parts of adolescent counseling, explaining that understanding her emotional and physical development was important for helping her cope with stress. Ashley, who had no experience with professional counseling, accepted his explanations and answered his questions honestly. The boundary violations escalated slowly and subtly. Mr. Brennan began offering Ashley rides home after their sessions, explaining that he was concerned about her walking alone while dealing with so much stress. During these car rides, he would place his hand on her shoulder or knee while talking, gestures that felt uncomfortable, but that Ashley rationalized as fatherly concern. He started giving her small gifts, books he thought she'd enjoy, snacks for her lunch, and eventually more personal items like jewelry that he said reminded him of her. The most disturbing aspect of Mr. Brennan's behavior was how he isolated Ashley from other potential sources of support. He convinced her that their counseling relationship was special and confidential, that sharing details of their conversations with others would violate professional ethics and could get him in trouble. He gradually turned her against her teachers, suggesting that they didn't really understand her situation and discouraged her from forming close friendships with other students, claiming that teenagers her age were too immature to provide real support. Ashley's mother, weakened by chemotherapy and focused on her own survival, didn't notice the changes in her daughter's behavior. Ashley had always been independent and responsible, and Carol trusted the school to provide appropriate support during this difficult time. When Ashley mentioned her regular meetings with Mr. Brennan, Carol was grateful that her daughter had found a caring adult to help her through the crisis. The situation escalated dramatically. During the spring of Ashley's junior year, Mr. Brennan began scheduling their sessions for after-school hours when the building was largely empty. He explained that this would give them more privacy and uninterrupted time to work through her issues. During one of these late sessions, he locked his office door and told Ashley that he wanted to try a new form of therapy that involved physical relaxation techniques. What followed was a pattern of sexual abuse that continued for months. Mr. Brennan used his position of authority and Ashley's emotional vulnerability to manipulate her into compliance, convincing her that their physical relationship was a normal part of the healing process. He told her that she was mature for her age and that their connection was special, something that other people wouldn't understand. He made her feel responsible for maintaining their secret, warning her that revealing their relationship would destroy his family and career, while also getting her in trouble for participating. The psychological manipulation was as damaging as the physical abuse. Mr. Brennan convinced Ashley that she was complicit in their relationship, that she had somehow initiated or encouraged his behavior. He alternated between treating her as a mature woman, capable of making adult decisions, and reminding her that she was just a confused teenager who needed his guidance. This emotional whiplash left Ashley feeling confused, guilty, and completely dependent on his approval. The abuse continued throughout the remainder of Ashley's junior year and into the summer. Mr. Brennan found ways to maintain contact even when school wasn't in session, offering to help her with college preparation and summer reading assignments. He would pick her up from her job at the animal shelter, take her to his office in the empty school building, and continue the pattern of abuse that had become normalized in Ashley's mind. The turning point came in August, just before Ashley's senior year began. Mr. Brennan had been escalating his demands, pressuring Ashley to meet him at locations outside of school, and becoming increasingly possessive of her time and attention. During one particularly disturbing encounter, he told Ashley that he was considering leaving his wife and that they could have a real relationship once she graduated. The prospect of their secret relationship becoming public terrified Ashley more than the abuse itself, and she finally began to understand that what was happening to her was wrong. Ashley's awakening to the reality of her situation was gradual and painful. She began researching sexual abuse online, reading stories from other survivors, and learning about the tactics predators use to manipulate their victims. She recognized her own experience in these accounts and slowly began to understand that Mr. Brennan had been grooming and abusing her for over a year. The realization filled her with shame, anger, and a desperate need to escape the situation. The decision to report the abuse was the most difficult thing Ashley had ever done. She was terrified that no one would believe her, that Mr. Brennan's reputation in the community would protect him, while she would be branded as a troubled teenager making false accusations. She was also afraid of the impact on her mother, who was still recovering from cancer treatment and didn't need additional stress. But the fear of continuing the abuse outweighed her other concerns, and Ashley finally found the courage to speak to a teacher she trusted. The investigation that followed was thorough and devastating. School administrators immediately suspended Mr. Brennan and contacted law enforcement, who launched a criminal investigation into Ashley's allegations. The process was traumatic for Ashley, who had to recount the details of her abuse multiple times to different investigators, each retelling, forcing her to relive the trauma she was trying to escape. The investigation revealed that Ashley wasn't Mr. Brennan's only victim. 2 other former students came forward with similar stories of abuse, describing a pattern of behavior that had been going on for years. The evidence painted a picture of a predator who had used his position of trust and authority to systematically abuse vulnerable students, always choosing girls who were dealing with family problems or other personal crises that made them particularly susceptible to manipulation. Mr. Brennan was arrested and charged with multiple counts of sexual abuse of a minor and abuse of a position of trust. The case sent shockwaves through Riverside, where many residents struggled to reconcile the image of the caring counselor they thought they knew with the predator he had revealed himself to be. Some community members initially supported Mr. Brennan, finding it difficult to believe that such a respected figure could be capable of such crimes. The trial was a media circus that turned Ashley's private trauma into public spectacle. Defense attorneys attempted to portray her as a troubled teenager who had initiated the relationship and then fabricated abuse allegations when it ended. They pointed to her family's financial struggles and her mother's illness as evidence that she was seeking attention or financial compensation. The cross-examination was brutal, with Ashley forced to defend not only her account of the abuse, but also her character and motivations. Despite the defense's efforts, the evidence against Mr. Brennan was overwhelming. The testimony of multiple victims, combined with physical evidence and documentation of his inappropriate behavior, led to his conviction on all charges. He was sentenced to 15 years in prison, but the damage to his victims and the community was irreversible. Ashley's senior year was marked by the ongoing legal proceedings and the social fallout from her decision to report the abuse. Some classmates and community members supported her courage in coming forward, but others blamed her for destroying a respected man's life and career. The stress of the trial, combined with the trauma of the abuse itself, affected her academic performance and her plans for college. The case highlighted the vulnerability of students to abuse by authority figures and the inadequate safeguards in place to protect them. It also demonstrated the additional trauma that victims face when they report abuse, particularly when the perpetrator is a respected member of the community. Ashley's experience became a catalyst for changes in school policies regarding counselor-student interactions and mandatory reporting procedures. Ashley eventually graduated from high school and went on to study social work rather than veterinary medicine, dedicating her life to helping other survivors of abuse. She never fully recovered from the trauma of her experience with Mr. Brennan, but she found purpose in using her story to educate others about the warning signs of predatory behavior and the importance of believing survivors when they find the courage to speak out. The Riverside community was forever changed by the revelation that one of their most trusted figures had been preying on the children he was supposed to protect. Parents became more vigilant about their children's interactions with authority figures, and the school district implemented new policies designed to prevent similar abuse. But the scars left by Mr. Brennan's crimes would take generations to heal. serving as a permanent reminder that evil can hide behind the most respectable facades. Ashley's ordeal lasted months, but in Blackwater, West Virginia, terror struck in a single night when a mysterious hotel guest brought something far more disturbing than anyone could have imagined. Let's move to our sixth story. Blackwater, West Virginia, was a town that time seemed to have forgotten. Nestled deep in the Appalachian Mountains, where coal mining had once been king, and now only memories remained. Population 123, where the main street consisted of a handful of struggling businesses, and the grand old Blackwater Inn stood as a monument to better days. The inn had been built in 1923, during the town's prosperous years. A three-story brick building with ornate Victorian details that had once hosted traveling businessmen and politicians. By 2020, it served mostly as a way station for truckers and the occasional lost tourist, managed by Thomas Whitmore, a man who had inherited both the building and its burden of keeping the past alive. Thomas was 45 years old, a soft-spoken man with graying temples, who had returned to Blackwater after his father's death to take over the family business. He had spent 20 years working in hotel management in Charleston, but the call of family obligation and the hope of revitalizing his hometown had brought him back to the mountains. The inn had seen better days. The wallpaper was faded, the carpets worn thin, and the heating system temperamental, but Thomas took pride in maintaining what remained of its former elegance. The inn typically hosted the same types of guests, week after week: long haul truckers who needed a clean bed and a hot meal, traveling salesmen covering rural territories, and the occasional family visiting relatives in the area. Thomas knew most of his regular customers by name and had developed a routine that kept the small operation running smoothly despite its challenges. He handled the front desks during the day while his part-time employee, Mrs. Henderson, managed the evening shift and helped with housekeeping. It was on a cold Tuesday evening in November when the stranger arrived. Thomas was working late, catching up on paperwork in the small office behind the front desk, when he heard the bell above the entrance door chime. He looked up to see a tall, thin man in his 50s standing in the lobby, wearing a long black coat that dripped with melted snow. The man had pale skin, dark hair slicked back with pomade, and eyes that seemed to take in every detail of the room with unsettling intensity. The stranger approached the desk with measured steps, his expensive leather shoes clicking against the worn marble floor. When he spoke, his voice was cultured and precise with an accent that Thomas couldn't quite place. Perhaps European, but filtered through years of American residence. He requested a room for an extended stay, explaining that he was conducting research in the area and would need accommodations for at least 2 weeks, possibly longer. Thomas was pleased to have a long-term guest, especially during the slow winter months when business was particularly sparse. The stranger, who registered under the name Dr. Henrik Volker, paid for 2 weeks in advance with crisp $100 bills, tipping generously and expressing appreciation for the inn's authentic character. He requested a room on the 3rd floor, preferably one facing away from the street, explaining that he needed quiet for his work and was sensitive to noise. Dr. Volkar was assigned to room 312, a corner suite that had once been the inn's finest accommodation. The room featured high ceilings, tall windows, and period furniture that Thomas's grandmother had selected decades earlier. It also had the advantage of being somewhat isolated from the other occupied rooms, which Thomas thought would provide the quiet the guest had requested. Over the following days, Dr. Volker proved to be an unusual but seemingly harmless guest. He kept regular hours, leaving the inn each morning around 9 and returning in the late afternoon with various packages and supplies. He was polite but distant with Thomas and the staff, always courteous, but never engaging in the small talk that characterized most guest interactions. He took his meals in his room, ordering simple fare from the inn's limited room service menu, and never used the common areas or lounges. What struck Thomas as odd was the nature of the packages Dr. Volkar received. They arrived daily via various shipping services, some small and light, others large and heavy enough to require assistance getting them to his room. When Thomas offered to help, Dr. Volker politely declined, insisting he could manage on his own. The packages bore return addresses from medical supply companies, antique dealers, and specialty manufacturers that Thomas didn't recognize. The sounds from room 312 began to concern Thomas. After the first week, during the day, when Dr. Volker was supposedly out conducting research, Thomas could hear what sounded like construction or assembly work coming from the room. There were rhythmic hammering sounds, the whir of power, tools, and the occasional scraping of heavy objects being moved across the floor. When Thomas mentioned the noise to Dr. Volkar, the man explained that he was setting up specialized equipment for his research and apologized for any disturbance. Mrs. Henderson, who cleaned the rooms during the day, reported that Dr. Volkar had specifically requested that housekeeping not enter his room. He had hung a do not disturb sign that remained in place constantly, and he had, politely but firmly, declined all offers of cleaning service. This wasn't entirely unusual. Some guests preferred privacy, but combined with the mysterious packages and strange sounds, it began to create an atmosphere of unease. The situation escalated on a Thursday night during Dr. Volkar's second week at the inn. Thomas was working late again, reviewing the monthly accounts, when he heard what sounded like a loud crash from the third floor. The sound was followed by a series of thuds and what might have been shouting, though the words were indistinct. Thomas waited for several minutes, listening for additional sounds or for Dr. Volkar to call the front desk for assistance, but the building fell silent again. Concerned about potential damage to the room or injury to his guest, Thomas climbed the stairs to the third floor and knocked on the door of room 312. There was no response, though he could see light under the door and could hear what sounded like classical music playing softly inside. He knocked again, more loudly this time, and called out to ask if everything was all right. After several minutes, Dr. Volker's voice came through the door, assuring Thomas that everything was fine and that he had simply dropped some equipment. Thomas returned to his office, but the incident left him feeling unsettled. The crash had been loud enough to wake other guests, and the explanation of dropped equipment didn't seem adequate to account for the sound. He made a note to check the room carefully when Dr. Provoker eventually checked out, concerned about potential damage that might not be immediately visible. The discovery came 3 days later on a Sunday morning when Dr. Volker failed to appear for his usual departure time. Thomas had noticed that the guest's car was still in the parking lot well past noon, and there had been no sounds from room 312 since the previous evening. Concerned that Dr. Volker might be ill or injured, Thomas used his master key to enter the room for a welfare check. What Thomas found in room 312 would haunt him for the rest of his life. Dr. Volker had used the packages he'd been receiving to construct an elaborate and functional guillotine in the center of the room. The device was built with meticulous attention to historical detail, featuring a heavy wooden frame, a precisely weighted blade, and a mechanism that appeared to be in perfect working order. The antique furniture had been moved aside to make room for the construction, and the walls were covered with historical documents and diagrams related to the French Revolution and methods of execution. Dr. Volkar himself was found beneath the blade of his creation, decapitated by the device he had spent 2 weeks assembling. The scene was arranged with disturbing precision. His body was positioned exactly as it would have been during a historical execution, and there were no signs of struggle or accident. A detailed journal found on the room's desk revealed that Dr. Volker had been planning his suicide for months, researching historical execution methods, and seeking what he described as an authentic and honorable death. The journal entries painted a picture of a man consumed by guilt over unspecified past actions and convinced that only death by guillotine could provide the atonement he sought. He had chosen the Blackwater Inn specifically because of its isolation and the likelihood that his activities would go unnoticed until after his death. The entries also revealed that Dr. Volkar wasn't his real name. He was actually Dr. Hinrich Fulmer, a former university professor who had been dismissed from his position following allegations of academic fraud and misconduct. The investigation that followed brought unwanted attention to the small town of Blackwater, and the struggling inn. Police, coroners, and media descended on the quiet mountain community, turning Thomas's business into a crime scene and a source of morbid curiosity. The story of the professor who built a guillotine in a hotel room captured national attention, with news outlets focusing on the bizarre nature of the suicide and the historical accuracy of the device he had constructed. The psychological impact on Thomas was severe and lasting. He had discovered the scene himself, and the image of Dr. Volkar's headless body beneath the guillotine blade was seared into his memory. The cleanup process was extensive and traumatic, requiring specialized services to remove not only the body but also the guillotine itself, which had to be disassembled piece by piece. The room had to be completely renovated, with new flooring, wallpaper, and even structural repairs to address damage caused by the device's construction. The incident effectively ended Thomas's hopes of revitalizing the Blackwater Inn. The story of the guillotine suicide became permanently associated with the hotel, and bookings dropped dramatically. As word spread through the tight-knit community of travelers who frequented such establishments, Thomas struggled to maintain operations for another year. But the combination of reduced revenue and his own psychological trauma eventually forced him to close the inn permanently. The building stood empty for several years before being purchased by a developer who planned to convert it into apartments. However, the project was abandoned when workers reported feeling uncomfortable in the building, particularly on the third floor where room 312 had been located. Local residents began to avoid the building, claiming they could hear the sound of construction work coming from the empty structure at night. Thomas moved away from Blackwater shortly after closing the inn. Unable to continue living in a place that held such traumatic memories, he never worked in hospitality again, finding employment in an unrelated field where he could avoid the constant reminders of his experience with Dr. Volkar. The incident had taught him that even the most ordinary business interactions could conceal unimaginable darkness, and that sometimes the most polite and well-mannered guests are the ones harboring the most disturbing secrets. The case became a subject of study for psychologists and criminologists interested in elaborate suicide methods and the psychology of individuals who plan their deaths with such meticulous attention to detail. Dr. Volkar's journal provided insights into the mind of someone consumed by guilt and convinced that only a historically significant form of death could provide adequate punishment for his perceived sins. The people of Blackwater were left to grapple with the knowledge that their quiet mountain town had been chosen as the site for such a bizarre and disturbing act. The incident reinforced the isolation and economic decline that had been plaguing the community for years, adding a layer of notoriety that made it even more difficult to attract new businesses or residents. The cleanup took weeks, but the psychological scars in the next town lasted generations, as the people of Willowbrook, Kentucky, were about to discover that some family secrets are too dark to ever truly bury. Let's move to our seventh story. Willowbrook, Kentucky, was a town where family names carried weight and history, stretched back through generations like roots in fertile soil. Population 2,847, where the same surnames appeared on mailboxes throughout the valley, and where everyone knew which family had settled which farm first. The rolling hills were dotted with century-old homesteads, and the local cemetery told the story of bloodlines that had intertwined for over 200 years. It was here that 9-year-old Sarah Mitchell learned that some family legacies are too horrific to inherit. Sarah had always been fascinated by genealogy, spending her weekends tracing family trees and her evenings poring over historical records in the basement of the Willowbrook Public Library. As a freelance researcher who specialized in family histories for clients across the country, she had developed a reputation for uncovering connections that others missed and for bringing forgotten ancestors back to life through meticulous documentation. Her own family history had always been a source of pride. The Mitchells had been among the first settlers in the valley, establishing a farm that had remained in the family for 6 generations. Sarah's interest in her own lineage intensified after her grandmother's death in the spring of 2021. While cleaning out the old farmhouse where her grandmother had lived alone for the past decade, Sarah discovered a collection of documents and photographs that had been stored in a trunk in the attic. The papers included land deeds, marriage certificates, and correspondence dating back to the 1800s, providing a treasure trove of information about her ancestors that she had never seen before. Among the documents was a leather-bound journal that had belonged to her great-great-grandfather, Ezekiel Mitchell, who had owned the family farm during the late 1800s. The journal's early entries were routine accounts of farm life, weather observations, crop yields, and records of livestock purchases and sales. But as Sarah read deeper into the journal, she began to find entries that made her increasingly uncomfortable. Ezekiel had apparently employed a series of farmhands over the years, men who had worked the land in exchange for room and board. The journal entries about these workers started normally enough, with notes about their work performance and character. But gradually, the tone of the entries changed, becoming more critical and eventually openly hostile. Ezekiel wrote about the workers with growing contempt, describing them as lazy, dishonest, and unworthy of his generosity. The entries became increasingly disturbing as Sarah continued reading. Ezekiel began documenting what he called disciplinary measures he had taken against workers who had displeased him. These punishments started as wage deductions and extra work assignments, but they escalated to physical violence and psychological torment. The journal described beatings, forced labor in dangerous conditions, and deliberate withholding of food and medical care. Sarah initially tried to rationalize what she was reading, telling herself that the harsh treatment of workers was unfortunately common in that era and that her ancestor was simply a product of his time. But as she continued through the journal, she found entries that went far beyond the typical exploitation of laborers. Ezekiel had begun to view his farmhands as less than human, referring to them as specimens and subjects in his increasingly erratic handwriting. The most horrifying discovery came in the journal's final entries written during the winter of 1887. Ezekiel had apparently become convinced that his farm hands were plotting against him, and he had decided to take preemptive action. The entries described a systematic campaign of murder that had taken place over several months, with Ezekiel killing his workers one by one and disposing of their bodies in various locations around the farm. The journal entries were detailed and methodical, describing not only the murders themselves, but also Ezekiel's thoughts and feelings about each killing. He wrote about the satisfaction he felt in cleansing his property of what he saw as inferior beings, and he expressed pride in his ability to make the deaths appear accidental or to make the victims simply disappear without trace. The final entry, dated February 14th, 1888, mentioned that he had completed the purification and that the farm was now clean and worthy. Sarah's hands shook as she read these final entries, her mind struggling to process the implications of what she had discovered. Her great-great-grandfather hadn't just been a harsh employer. He had been a serial killer who had murdered an unknown number of men who had worked his land. The family farm that had been a source of pride for generations had been built on a foundation of systematic murder and violence. The discovery sent Sarah into a spiral of research and investigation that consumed her life for the following months. She began searching through historical records, looking for any evidence that might corroborate or contradict what she had found in the journal. She studied newspaper archives from the 880 seconds, looking for reports of missing persons or unexplained deaths in the area. She examined land records and census data, trying to identify the men who had worked for Ezekiel and determined what had happened to them. What Sarah found confirmed her worst fears. The historical record showed a pattern of men who had worked for Ezekiel Mitchell and then simply vanished without explanation. These weren't drifters or transients who might have moved on to other opportunities. They were local men with families and connections in the community who had disappeared without saying goodbye to loved ones or collecting wages they were owed. The newspaper archives revealed several articles about missing farmhands in the area during the 1,880 seconds. Though none of them directly connected the disappearances to Ezekiel Mitchell, the articles described worried families searching for missing sons and husbands, and they mentioned the frustration of local authorities who were unable to find any trace of the missing men. Reading these accounts, Sarah realized that her ancestor had destroyed not just individual lives, but entire families who had been left to wonder what had happened to their loved ones. Sarah's investigation also revealed that the disappearances had stopped abruptly in early 1888, coinciding with a final entry in Ezekiel's journal. Historical records showed that Ezekiel himself had died in March of that year, apparently from a sudden illness that had taken him within a matter of days. Some accounts suggested that his death had been unexpected and somewhat mysterious, with symptoms that didn't match any known disease. The more Sarah learned about her ancestors' crimes, the more she began to understand the impact they had had on the local community. The disappearances had created an atmosphere of fear and suspicion that had persisted for years, with families reluctant to send their sons to work on isolated farms and workers demanding higher wages to compensate for the perceived risks. The Mitchell family had apparently been viewed with suspicion by some members of the community, though the specific reasons had been lost to time. Sarah faced an agonizing decision about what to do with her discovery. The journal provided evidence of crimes that had been committed over 130 years earlier, far beyond any statute of limitations, and involving people who were long dead. But the families of the victims might still have descendants in the area, people who had grown up wondering what had happened to their ancestors and who deserved to know the truth. The decision was complicated by the potential impact on her own family's reputation and standing in the community. The Mitchell name was still respected in Willowbrook, and Sarah's relatives included prominent business owners, teachers, and community leaders who would be devastated by the revelation of their ancestors' crimes. Sarah also worried about the impact on the current owners of the family farm, who had purchased the property from her relatives and had no connection to its dark history. After months of internal struggle, Sarah decided that the truth needed to be revealed. Regardless of the personal cost, she contacted the local historical society and arranged to donate Ezekiel's journal and her research findings to their archives. She also reached out to genealogical societies and historical researchers who might be able to help identify the descendants of the victims and provide them with closure about their ancestors' fates. The revelation of Ezekiel Mitchell's crimes sent shockwaves through the Willowbrook community. The story was picked up by regional newspapers and eventually gained national attention as an example of how family history research could uncover dark secrets from the past. The Mitchell family was forced to confront the reality that their ancestor had been a murderer, and several family members struggled with feelings of guilt and shame, despite having no personal connection to the crimes. The discovery also had a profound impact on the local community's understanding of its own history. The disappearances that had been mysterious for over a century suddenly had an explanation, and families who had wondered about missing ancestors finally had answers. Some descendants of the victims expressed gratitude to Sarah for her courage in revealing the truth, while others struggled with a painful knowledge of how their ancestors had died. Sarah's experience fundamentally changed her relationship with genealogy and family history. She continued her research work, but she approached it with a new understanding of the potential for family secrets to be far darker than anyone might imagine. She became an advocate for transparency in historical research, arguing that the truth about the past, no matter how uncomfortable, was preferable to the perpetuation of lies and cover-ups. The Mitchell farm itself became a site of morbid curiosity, with amateur historians and true crime enthusiasts making pilgrimages to see the place where the murders had occurred. The current owners eventually sold the property and moved away, unable to cope with the constant attention and the knowledge of what had happened on their land. The farm was eventually purchased by a developer who planned to subdivide it for housing. But the project was abandoned when potential buyers learned about the property's history. Sarah moved away from Willowbrook shortly after making her discovery public, finding it impossible to continue living in a community where her family name had become synonymous with historical horror. She relocated to a city where she could work anonymously and where her past wouldn't follow her. But she never forgot the lesson she had learned about the dangers of family pride and the importance of confronting uncomfortable truths about the past. The case became a subject of study for historians and criminologists interested in historical serial killers and the ways in which crimes from the past can continue to impact communities generations later. Ezekiel Mitchell's journal was preserved as a historical document, serving as evidence of the capacity for evil that can exist in even the most ordinary-seeming individuals, and the importance of remembering victims whose stories might otherwise be lost to time. Sarah's bloodline carried darkness, but in Oakville, Texas, evil wore a badge, and justice became just, another word for the powerful, protecting their own. Let's move to our eighth story. Oakville, Texas, was a town where the Friday night lights of high school football illuminated more than just the field. They cast long shadows over a community where power and corruption had become as traditional as homecoming parades. Population 4,521, where oil money had built mansions on one side of town, while trailer parks housed those who served the wealthy, and where the sheriff's badge carried more weight than justice itself. It was here that 7-year-old Maria Santos learned that sometimes the people sworn to protect and serve are the very ones you need protection from. Maria lived in the east side of Oakville with her parents and younger brother in a modest house that her father Miguel had purchased with savings from 20 years of working at the local refinery. The Santos family had moved to Texas from El Paso when Maria was 10, seeking better opportunities and a safer environment for their children. Miguel worked double shifts to afford a house in what he believed was a good neighborhood, while Maria's mother, Carmen, cleaned houses for the wealthy families on the west side of town. Maria was a senior at Oakville High School, an honor student who had earned a partial scholarship to study nursing at the University of Texas. She was known for her quiet determination and her fierce loyalty to her family, working part-time at a local diner to help with household expenses, while maintaining a 3.8 gigapascals. Her younger brother Carlos was 15 and looked up to Maria as both a sister and a role model, often seeking her advice about school and friends. The Santos family had always taught their children to respect authority and to trust law enforcement, values that had been ingrained in them through their Catholic faith and their immigrant experience. When Maria began dating Jake Morrison, the son of Sheriff Robert Morrison, her parents were initially pleased that she was involved with a boy from such a prominent family. Jake was 18, a star athlete who was expected to receive a football scholarship to Texas A&M, and he came from a family that had been part of Oakville's power structure for 3 generations. The relationship between Maria and Jake began during their junior year and seemed like a typical high school romance. Jake was charming and popular, and dating him elevated Maria's social status at school. He was attentive and generous, taking her to expensive restaurants and buying her gifts that her family could never afford. Maria's parents were impressed by Jake's polite manner and his apparent respect for their daughter, and they welcomed him into their home with the warmth that characterized their family's approach to relationships. The first signs of trouble appeared during the spring of their senior year, when Jake's behavior began to change in subtle but concerning ways, he became increasingly possessive of Maria's time, demanding to know where she was going and who she was with when they weren't together. He began discouraging her from spending time with her female friends, claiming that they were jealous of their relationship and were trying to cause problems between them. Jake's possessiveness escalated into controlling behavior that Maria initially mistook for romantic devotion. He would show up unexpectedly at her workplace, claiming he wanted to surprise her, but actually checking to make sure she was where she said she would be. He began going through her phone and demanding explanations for text messages from male classmates, even when the communications were clearly related to school projects or work schedules. The situation became more serious when Maria began making plans for college. She had been accepted to the University of Texas with her partial scholarship, and she was excited about the opportunity to pursue her dream of becoming a nurse. But Jake became increasingly upset about her college plans, arguing that she should stay in Oakville and attend the local community college so they could remain together. He began pressuring her to give up her scholarship and her dreams, claiming that their relationship was more important than her education. Maria's parents noticed the change in their daughter's demeanor and tried to discuss their concerns with her. Carmen observed that Maria seemed anxious and withdrawn, constantly checking her phone and appearing nervous when Jake was around. Miguel noticed that Jake had become more demanding and less respectful during his visits to their home, treating Maria more like property than a girlfriend. But when they tried to express their concerns, Maria defended Jake and insisted that they didn't understand the pressures he was facing as a senior athlete. The breaking point came in late May, just weeks before graduation, when Maria finally found the courage to end the relationship. She had realized that Jake's behavior was becoming increasingly unhealthy and that she couldn't sacrifice her future for someone who didn't respect her autonomy. The conversation took place in Jake's car after a school event, and Maria tried to be gentle but firm in explaining that they wanted different things and that it would be better for both of them to end the relationship. Jake's reaction was explosive and terrifying. He became enraged, screaming at Maria and calling her ungrateful for everything he had done for her. He accused her of using him for his family, status, and money, and he made threats about what would happen if she tried to leave him. When Maria insisted that the relationship was over and asked him to take her home, Jake's anger turned violent. He grabbed her by the arms, shaking her and telling her that no one left him, especially not someone from her background. Maria managed to escape from the car and ran home. But Jake's threats continued through phone calls and text messages. He alternated between apologizing and promising to change, and making increasingly disturbing threats about what he would do to her and her family if she didn't take him back. Maria was terrified but felt trapped, knowing that Jake's father was the sheriff and that the Morrison family had significant influence in the community. The harassment continued for several days, with Jake following Maria to work and school, leaving threatening messages, and even showing up at her house when her parents weren't home. Maria finally decided to report the threats to the police, believing that even if Jake's father was the sheriff, there would be other officers who would take her complaint seriously and help protect her family. Maria's decision to report Jake's behavior to the police proved to be a fatal mistake. When she went to the Oakville Police Department to file a complaint, she was interviewed by Deputy Frank Collins, who listened to her story with apparent sympathy and concern. Collins took detailed notes about Jake's threats and behavior, and he assured Maria that the department would take appropriate action to protect her and her family. What Maria didn't know was that Deputy Collins immediately reported her complaint to Sheriff Morrison, who was furious that Maria had dared to accuse his son of threatening behavior. Rather than investigating the allegations or taking steps to protect Maria, Sheriff Morrison began a campaign to discredit her and to protect his son from any consequences for his actions. The cover-up began with Sheriff Morrison visiting Maria's parents at their home, ostensibly to discuss their daughter's complaint, but actually to intimidate them into withdrawing it. Morrison explained to Miguel and Carmen that their daughter was making serious accusations against his son, accusations that could ruin Jake's future and his chances for college scholarship. He suggested that Maria was probably confused or emotional about the breakup, and that it would be better for everyone if the complaint was quietly withdrawn. When Miguel and Carmen refused to pressure their daughter into withdrawing her complaint, Sheriff Morrison's approach became more threatening. He began making veiled references to the Santos family's immigration status, suggesting that there might be problems with their documentation that would require investigation. He also mentioned Miguel's employment at the refinery, implying that complaints from the sheriff's office about an employee's family could result in job loss. Despite the pressure from Sheriff Morrison, Maria refused to withdraw her complaint, and her parents supported her decision, but the family soon discovered the extent of the sheriff's power and his willingness to abuse it to protect his son. Miguel was suddenly subjected to increased scrutiny at work, with supervisors citing minor infractions that had previously been overlooked. Carmen found that several of her cleaning clients had abruptly terminated her services, claiming they no longer needed help, but offering no real explanation. The situation escalated dramatically when Jake's harassment turned violent. On a Friday night in early June, just days before graduation, Jake confronted Maria as she was leaving work at the diner. The confrontation took place in the parking lot behind the restaurant, away from witnesses and security cameras. Jake was drunk and enraged, screaming at Maria about her refusal to take him back and her persistence in pursuing the police complaint against him. What happened next was witnessed only by Maria and Jake, but the evidence would later tell a horrific story. Jake's anger exploded into deadly violence, and he attacked Maria with a brutality that shocked even the experienced investigators who would eventually examine the scene. Maria fought for her life, but she was no match for Jake's size and strength, especially in his alcohol-fueled rage. Jake killed Maria in that parking lot, strangling her with his bare hands while she pleaded for her life. But the murder was only the beginning of the cover-up that would follow. Jake immediately called his father, who arrived at the scene within minutes, and began orchestrating a plan to conceal his son's crime and protect the Morrison family's reputation. Sheriff Morrison's cover-up was systematic and thorough, utilizing his authority and connections to manipulate evidence and control the investigation. He arranged for Maria's body to be moved from the parking lot to a remote location outside of town, where it would be discovered days later by hikers. He destroyed evidence from the original crime scene and created false documentation to support an alternative timeline of events. The official investigation into Maria's death was a sham from the beginning. Sheriff Morrison assigned the case to Deputy Collins, who had already proven his willingness to participate in the 20 cover-up. The investigation focused on false leads and fabricated evidence, while the real evidence pointing to Jake was either destroyed or ignored. Jake was never seriously considered as a suspect, despite his history of threatening Maria and his obvious motive for wanting her dead. Maria's family was devastated by her death and frustrated by the lack of progress in the two-heard investigation. They hired a private investigator with money borrowed from relatives, but the investigator found his efforts blocked at every turn by the sheriff's department. Witnesses who might have provided useful information were intimidated into silence, and evidence that might have pointed to Jake was mysteriously unavailable or had been lost. The cover-up might have been successful if not for the persistence of Maria's brother, Carlos, who refused to accept the official version of events. Carlos had observed Jake's increasingly erratic behavior in the weeks before Maria's death, and he was convinced that Jake was responsible for his sister's murder. Despite threats and intimidation from the sheriff's department, Carlos continued to investigate on his own, gathering evidence and building a case against Jake. Carlos's investigation eventually attracted the attention of state authorities who launched their own inquiry into Maria's death and the conduct of the Oakville Police Department. The state investigation revealed the extent of Sheriff Morrison's corruption and his willingness to obstruct justice to protect his son. Evidence of the cover-up was overwhelming, including destroyed evidence, falsified reports, and witness intimidation. Jake Morrison was eventually arrested and charged with Maria's murder. But by then, crucial evidence had been destroyed, and witnesses had been intimidated into silence. The case that should have been straightforward became complicated by the cover-up and Jake's defense. Attorneys were able to create reasonable doubt about his guilt. He was ultimately convicted of manslaughter rather than murder and sentenced to only 8 years in prison. Sheriff Morrison was forced to resign in disgrace, but he was never charged with obstruction of justice or any other crimes related to the cover-up. The political connections that had protected him throughout his career continued to shield him from serious consequences, and he retired with his pension intact. Deputy Collins was transferred to another department, and the other officers who had participated in the cover-up faced only minor disciplinary actions. Maria's family never recovered from the loss of their daughter and the injustice of the legal system's failure to hold her killers fully accountable. Miguel and Carmen eventually moved away from Oakville, unable to continue living in a community where their daughter's murderer had been protected by those sworn to serve justice. Carlos dedicated his life to criminal justice reform, becoming an advocate for victims' families and working to expose corruption in law enforcement. The case became a symbol of the corruption that can flourish in small communities where powerful families are able to manipulate the justice system for their own benefit. It highlighted the vulnerability of immigrant families and working-class people when they come into conflict with established power structures, and it demonstrated the devastating consequences when law enforcement officers prioritize loyalty to their colleagues over their duty to serve justice. Mariah never got justice, and in Clearwater, Wisconsin, justice came too late for another young woman whose trust in someone she loved would cost her everything. Let's move to our 9th story. Clearwater, Wisconsin, was a college town where autumn painted the maple trees in brilliant reds and golds, and where the University of Wisconsin campus brought youthful energy to a community that had grown around education and small-town values. Population 12,847, where students and longtime residents coexisted in a harmony built on shared appreciation for quiet streets, local coffee shops, and the kind of safety that comes from knowing your neighbors. It was here that one 9-year-old Jennifer Walsh learned that the person you trust most can become the person you should fear above all others. Jennifer was a sophomore at the university, studying elementary education, with dreams of becoming a teacher in her hometown of Green Bay after graduation. She was the kind of young woman who still called her parents every Sunday, who sent handwritten thank you notes, and who had never missed a family holiday, despite the freedom that college life offered. With her blonde hair usually pulled back in a practical ponytail, and her backpack always loaded with textbooks, Jennifer embodied the earnest dedication that her professors appreciated and her classmates respected. She had been dating Ryan Kowalski for 8 months, a relationship that had begun during their freshman year when they met in a psychology class they both needed for their respective majors. Ryan was 20, a year older than Jennifer, studying business with plans to take over his family's construction company back in Milwaukee. He was tall and athletic, with the kind of easy confidence that came from growing up in a family where success was expected and achieved. To Jennifer's friends and family, Ryan seemed like the perfect boyfriend, attentive, ambitious, and clearly devoted to their relationship. The relationship had progressed naturally through the typical stages of college romance. They studied together in the library, attended football games as a couple, and spent weekends exploring the small towns surrounding Clearwater. Ryan was generous with gifts and attention, surprising Jennifer with flowers on random weekdays and remembering details about her classes and friendships that impressed her with his thoughtfulness. Her roommate Katie often commented on how lucky Jennifer was to have found someone so caring and committed. Jennifer's parents, David and Susan Walsh, had met Ryan during Parents' Weekend in October and had been immediately impressed by his polite manner and his obvious affection for their daughter. Ryan had asked thoughtful questions about their lives in Green Bay, had complimented Susan's cooking when they took him to dinner, and had engaged David in conversations about business and career planning that demonstrated maturity beyond his years. The Walshes had returned home, confident that their daughter was in good hands. The first signs of trouble in the relationship were so subtle that Jennifer initially dismissed them as normal relationship adjustments. Ryan began expressing concern about the amount of time Jennifer spent with her female friends, particularly Katie, whom he claimed was a bad influence who encouraged Jennifer to party too much. He started suggesting that Jennifer's study groups were unnecessary and that she would be better off studying with him instead of with classmates who might distract her from her academic goals. Ryan's concerns gradually evolved into more direct attempts to control Jennifer's social life. He would become sullen and withdrawn when she made plans that didn't include him, and he would guilt her into canceling activities by claiming that he had been looking forward to spending time with her. He began monitoring her phone usage, asking about text messages and phone calls in ways that seemed caring, but felt increasingly invasive to Jennifer. The controlling behavior escalated during the spring semester of their sophomore year. Ryan started showing up unexpectedly at Jennifer's classes and work-study job, claiming he wanted to surprise her, but actually checking to make sure she was where she said she would be. He began criticizing her appearance and her choices, suggesting that her clothes were too revealing or that her makeup made her look like she was trying to attract other men's attention. Jennifer's friends noticed the changes in her behavior and tried to express their concerns, but Ryan had successfully isolated her from most of her support network. Katie, her roommate, was particularly worried about the relationship and tried to talk to Jennifer about Ryan's possessive behavior. But Ryan had convinced Jennifer that Katie was jealous of their relationship and was trying to cause problems between them. So, Jennifer dismissed her roommate's concerns as misguided interference. The relationship reached a crisis point in April when Jennifer began to seriously consider ending it. The constant monitoring and criticism had worn down her self-esteem, and she was beginning to recognize that Ryan's behavior was unhealthy and controlling. She confided in her academic advisor, Professor Margaret Stevens, who encouraged her to trust her instincts and to seek support from the university's counseling services. Jennifer's decision to break up with Ryan was made during finals week, when the stress of exams, combined with Ryan's increasingly demanding behavior, became unbearable. She had planned to wait until after finals to have the conversation, but Ryan's jealous reaction to her study group sessions made it clear that the relationship couldn't continue. She asked to meet him at his apartment off campus, hoping that the private setting would allow them to have an honest conversation about their incompatibility. The breakup conversation took place on a Thursday evening in early May. In the living room of the apartment, Ryan shared with two other students who were away for the evening. Jennifer had rehearsed what she wanted to say, focusing on their different goals and her need for independence rather than on his controlling behavior. She tried to be gentle but clear, explaining that she cared about him, but that they wanted different things from a relationship. Ryan's initial reaction seemed to be acceptance, even understanding. He listened to Jennifer's explanation without interrupting, and he acknowledged that he had probably been too demanding and possessive. He apologized for his behavior and asked if there was anything he could do to change her mind, but he seemed to accept her decision when she explained that she needed time to focus on her studies and her own personal growth. But as the evening progressed, Ryan's demeanor began to change. He started asking more probing questions about Jennifer's reasons for ending the relationship, and he became increasingly agitated when she refused to give him specific examples of his problematic behavior. He began accusing her of having feelings for someone else, demanding to know if there was another man who had influenced her decision to break up with him. Jennifer tried to leave several times during the conversation, But Ryan kept finding reasons to continue talking, asking her to stay just a few more minutes to work through their problems. He alternated between apologizing and making accusations, between promising to change and threatening to hurt himself if she left him. The emotional manipulation was exhausting, and Jennifer found herself becoming increasingly anxious about Ryan's mental state. The situation escalated when Jennifer finally insisted that she needed to leave and return to her dormitory. Ryan became enraged, accusing her of using him and then discarding him when she no longer needed him. He began shouting about everything he had done for her, all the money he had spent on gifts and dates, and how ungrateful she was for his devotion. His anger was unlike anything Jennifer had ever seen from him, and she realized that she was seeing the real Ryan for the first time. When Jennifer moved toward the door, Ryan physically blocked her path, grabbing her by the arms and demanding that she sit down and listen to what he had to say. The physical contact was aggressive and frightening, and Jennifer realized that she was in real danger. She tried to reason with Ryan, promising that they could talk more later if he would just let her leave. But his rage had reached a point where rational conversation was impossible. What happened next would haunt the Clearwater community for years to come. Ryan's anger exploded into deadly violence, and he attacked Jennifer with a brutality that seemed impossible from someone who had claimed to love her. The attack was prolonged and vicious, with Ryan using his superior size and strength to overpower Jennifer's desperate attempts to defend herself. Jennifer fought for her life, but she was no match for Ryan's rage-fueled assault. He strangled her with his bare hands while she pleaded for her life, her final moments filled with the incomprehensible reality that the person she had trusted and cared for was killing her. The young woman who had dreamed of teaching children and building a life filled with purpose died, alone, in an apartment where she had once felt safe. After killing Jennifer, Ryan faced the horrifying reality of what he had done. But instead of calling for help or turning himself into authorities, he made a calculated decision to conceal his crime and protect himself from consequences. Ryan loaded Jennifer's body into his car and drove to his grandmother's house on the outskirts of town, a property that had been in his family for generations and where he knew he could work undisturbed. Ryan's grandmother, Eleanor Kowalski, was 87 years old and had been living in a nursing home for the past 2 years, leaving her house empty, except for occasional visits from family members checking on the property. The house sat on 5 acres of rural land with gardens and outbuildings that provided plenty of privacy for Ryan's grisly task. He buried Jennifer's body in the private 6-vegetable garden behind the house, in a spot where the soil was soft and where his digging wouldn't attract attention from neighbors. The cover-up that followed was methodical and chilling in its calculation. Ryan cleaned his apartment thoroughly, removing any evidence of the struggle that had taken place there. He disposed of Jennifer's personal belongings, scattering them in dumpsters across the city to avoid creating a concentrated trail of evidence. He created a false timeline for the evening, establishing alibis and preparing explanations for Jennifer's disappearance that would deflect suspicion from himself. When Jennifer failed to return to her dormitory that night, her roommate Katie initially assumed she had decided to stay at Ryan's apartment, something that happened occasionally, despite dormitory rules. But when Jennifer missed her morning classes and didn't respond to phone calls or text messages, Katie became worried and contacted the university's residential life office to report her missing. The initial investigation into Jennifer's disappearance focused on the possibility that she had left campus voluntarily, perhaps to deal with a family emergency or personal crisis. Ryan played the role of the concerned boyfriend perfectly, cooperating with campus security and local police while expressing worry about Jennifer's safety and well-being. He provided investigators with a detailed account of their evening together, claiming that Jennifer had left his apartment around 10 to return to her dormitory and that he hadn't heard from her since. Ryan's performance as the grieving boyfriend was convincing enough to deflect initial suspicion and the investigation focused on other possibilities for Jennifer's disappearance. Police interviewed her friends and classmates, looking for signs of depression or personal problems that might have motivated her to leave school. They examined her financial records and phone usage, searching for clues about where she might have gone or who she might have contacted. The investigation expanded when Jennifer's parents arrived in Clearwater and began their own search for their daughter, David and Susan. Walsh were devastated by Jennifer's disappearance and frustrated by what they saw as insufficient urgency from local authorities. They hired a private investigator and organized volunteer search parties, distributing flyers and conducting interviews with anyone who might have information about their daughter's whereabouts. Jennifer's body remained hidden in Eleanor Kowalski's garden for 3 months, while Ryan continued his charade of being a concerned ex-boyfriend, helping with the search efforts. He attended vigils and search parties, comforted Jennifer's friends and family, and maintained the facade of someone desperately hoping for her safe return. The psychological toll of maintaining this deception while living with the knowledge of what he had done began to affect Ryan's behavior. But the changes were subtle enough to be attributed to stress and grief. The discovery of Jennifer's body came about through a combination of persistence and luck. David Walsh had become convinced that Jennifer's disappearance was connected to her relationship with Ryan. Despite the young man's apparent cooperation with the investigation, David began conducting his own surveillance of Ryan, following him and documenting his activities in hopes of finding some clue about what had happened to Jennifer. David's surveillance led him to Eleanor Kowalski's property, where he observed Ryan making several visits that seemed to have no clear purpose. Ryan would arrive at the house, spend time in the backyard, and then leave without appearing to accomplish any specific task. David's suspicions were aroused by these mysterious visits, and he eventually contacted police with his observations. The police investigation of Eleanor Kowalski's property initially found nothing suspicious, but a more thorough search using cadaver dogs led to the discovery of Jennifer's remains in the garden behind the house. The condition of the body and the circumstances of its burial made it clear that Jennifer had been murdered, and the location of the grave immediately focused suspicion on Ryan, who had access to the property and had been observed visiting it multiple times. Ryan was arrested and charged with Jennifer's murder, but he maintained his innocence even when confronted with overwhelming evidence of his guilt. The trial that followed was emotionally devastating for Jennifer's family and friends, who were forced to relive the trauma of her disappearance. While learning the horrific details of how she had died, Ryan's defense attorneys attempted to portray the killing as a crime of passion rather than premeditated murder, arguing that their client had acted in the heat of emotion rather than with calculated intent. The evidence against Ryan was overwhelming, including forensic evidence linking him to Jennifer's death and witness testimony about his controlling behavior during their relationship. The jury convicted him of first-degree murder, and he was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. But the conviction provided little comfort to Jennifer's family, who had lost their daughter to someone they had trusted and welcomed into their home. The case had a profound impact on the Clearwater community and the university campus, shattering the sense of safety that had characterized the town and forcing students and residents to confront the reality that domestic violence could strike anywhere. The university implemented new programs to educate students about healthy relationships and warning signs of abuse, and local law enforcement received additional training in investigating domestic violence cases. Jennifer's parents established a scholarship in her memory for students studying education, ensuring that her dream of teaching children would live on through others who shared her passion. They also became advocates for domestic violence awareness, speaking at universities and community events about the warning signs of abusive relationships and the importance of supporting friends and family members who might be in danger. The case served as a tragic reminder that the people we trust most can sometimes be the most dangerous, and that love can become twisted into something deadly when combined with possessiveness and the inability to accept rejection. Jennifer's death highlighted the vulnerability of young women in college relationships and the importance of recognizing and addressing controlling behavior before it escalates to violence. Jennifer's grave was hidden for months, but some secrets refused to stay buried, as the people of Thornfield, Massachusetts were about to discover when a 300-year-old mystery would prove that madness and obsession transcend the boundaries of time itself. Let's move to our 10th story. Thornfield, Massachusetts, was a town where colonial history lived in every brick and weathered shingle, where the past seemed to whisper from behind every shuttered window and beneath every moss-covered headstone. Population 2,934, where the oldest families could trace their lineage back to the Mayflower, and where the local historical society treated every artifact like a sacred relic. It was here that 8-year-old Dr. Elizabeth Kane, a historian specializing in colonial New England, discovered that some obsessions are so powerful they can transcend death itself. Dr. Kane had come to Thornfield in the fall of 2022 to research her book about burial practices in Puritan communities. Drawn by the town's exceptionally well-preserved colonial cemetery and its extensive historical records dating back to 1692, she had rented a small apartment above the town's bookstore and had quickly become a familiar figure in the local library and historical society, spending her days poring over centuries-old documents and her evenings walking among the weathered headstones that held the stories she was trying to tell. The Thornfield Historical Society was housed in a converted colonial mansion that had belonged to the Blackwood family, one of the town's founding families whose influence had shaped the community for over 3 centuries. The society's president, Mrs. Dorothy Ashworth, was a descendant of the original Blackwoods and took great pride in maintaining the family's legacy and the town's historical integrity. She had welcomed Dr. Kane's research project enthusiastically, providing access to private family documents and records that weren't available to the general public. It was while examining these private Blackwood family papers that Dr. Kane first encountered the story of Cornelius Blackwood, a wealthy merchant who had lived in Thornfield during the early 1700s. Cornelius had been one of the town's most prominent citizens, owning several ships that traded between Boston and the Caribbean, and his wealth had allowed him to build the largest house in Thornfield and to wield considerable political influence in colonial Massachusetts. The initial documents about Cornelius painted a picture of a successful but unremarkable colonial businessman. But as Dr. Kane delved deeper into the base family archives, she began to find references to behavior that seemed increasingly eccentric and disturbing. Letters from family members and business associates described Cornelius as becoming obsessed with death and resurrection, spending vast amounts of money on books about alchemy and the occult, and making increasingly bizarre statements about his plans for the afterlife. The most intriguing discovery was a series of letters written by Cornelius himself during the final years of his life, documents that revealed a man consumed by the belief that he could achieve physical resurrection through careful planning and the application of what he believed to be scientific principles. Cornelius had become convinced that death was merely a temporary state that could be overcome through proper preparation and the right combination of preservation techniques and spiritual practices. Dr. Kane's research revealed that Cornelius had spent the last decade of his life preparing for what he called his great experiment, an attempt to preserve his body after death in such a way that he could return to life. Exactly 30 years later, he had studied Egyptian mummification techniques, consulted with alchemists and occultists, and had even corresponded with European scholars who claimed to have discovered the secrets of eternal life. The letters described Cornelius's elaborate preparations for his death and resurrection, including the construction of a special burial chamber and the acquisition of rare chemicals and preservatives that he believed would maintain his body in a state of suspended animation. He had also made detailed arrangements for his estate to be managed during his 30-year absence, with instructions for his servants to maintain his house and his business interests until his anticipated return. Most disturbing of all were Cornelius's writings about the specific date he had chosen for his resurrection, October 31st, 1723, exactly 30 years after his planned death. On October 31st, 1693, he had calculated this date based on his study of astrological charts and occult texts, believing that the alignment of celestial bodies would provide the spiritual energy necessary for his return to life. The letters revealed a man who had become completely consumed by his obsession, spending his final years in isolation while perfecting his resurrection plan. Dr. K's investigation into Cornelius's death revealed that he had indeed died on October 31st, 1693, apparently from natural causes, though some contemporary accounts suggested that he might have hastened his own death through the use of exotic chemicals and preparations. The circumstances of his burial were highly unusual for the time period, with Cornelius having made specific arrangements for his body to be interred in a specially constructed chamber rather than in the town's regular cemetery. The burial chamber had been built in the basement of a large barn on Cornelius's property, a location that he had chosen because it would provide protection from the elements while remaining accessible for his anticipated resurrection. The chamber was lined with stone and sealed with a combination of wax, lead, creating an environment that Cornelius believed would preserve his body indefinitely. He had also arranged for various artifacts and supplies to be buried with him, including books, chemicals, and even food that he expected to need upon his return. The most chilling aspect of Dr. Kane's research was the discovery of documents describing what had happened on October 31st, 1723, the date Cornelius had chosen for his resurrection. According to family records and contemporary accounts, a group of Cornelius's former servants and business associates had gathered at the barn on that night, apparently believing that their former master might actually return from the dead as he had promised. The accounts of that night were fragmentary and contradictory, but they painted a picture of a gathering that had begun with skeptical curiosity and had ended in terror and chaos. Several witnesses reported hearing sounds coming from the sealed burial chamber, knocking, scratching, and what some described as muffled screaming. The sounds had continued for several hours, growing more frantic and desperate as the night progressed. The most detailed account came from a letter written by Thomas Whitmore, Cornelius's former business partner, who described the events of that night in terms that suggested he had witnessed something that had shaken his faith in the natural order of the world. Whitmore wrote about the sounds from the chamber, the growing panic among the assembled witnesses, and the ultimate decision to flee the barn rather than investigate further. Dr. Kane's research revealed that the barn had been abandoned immediately after that night, with the Blackwood family refusing to discuss what had happened or to allow anyone to examine the burial chamber. The property had eventually been sold to another family, but the barn had remained sealed and unused, with local residents avoiding the area and spreading stories about strange sounds and unexplained phenomena. The barn had burned down in 1847, apparently in a fire that had started spontaneously and had resisted all attempts to extinguish it. The fire had been so intense that it had destroyed not only the wooden structure, but it also cracked and damaged the wooden stone burial chamber beneath. Local residents had reported that the fire had burned with an unusual blue flame and had produced smoke that smelled of sulfur and decay. Dr. Kane's investigation led her to the site where the barn had once stood, now an empty lot overgrown with weeds and brambles on the outskirts of Thornfield. Using historical maps and property records, she was able to locate the approximate position of the burial chamber and to identify the stone foundations that remain visible beneath the vegetation. The discovery of physical evidence at the site confirmed many of the details from the historical documents. Dr. Kane found fragments of the stone burial chamber, pieces of lead and wax that had been used for sealing, and even some artifacts that appeared to be from the colonial period. Most significantly, she discovered human remains that appeared to be from the right time period and that showed signs of unusual preservation techniques. The condition of the remains was disturbing and puzzling to the forensic experts who examined them. The bones showed evidence of chemical treatment that was consistent with Cornelius's documented preservation experiments, but they also displayed damage that suggested violent trauma had occurred long after death. Some bones were fractured in ways that indicated desperate struggling, as if the person had been trying to break free from confinement. Most chilling of all was the discovery of scratch marks on the interior walls of the burial chamber fragments, marks that appeared to have been made by human fingernails and that suggested someone had been clawing desperately at the stone walls from the inside. The pattern and depth of the scratches indicated that this activity had continued for an extended period, possibly hours or even days. Dr. Kane's research into the Cornelius Blackwood case attracted the attention of paranormal investigators and occult researchers who saw it as evidence of successful resurrection or supernatural intervention. But Dr. Kane approached the case from a historical and scientific perspective, seeking rational explanations for the documented phenomena, while acknowledging that some aspects of the case remained genuinely mysterious. The most likely explanation for the events of October 31st, 1723, was that Cornelius had not actually died on his planned date, but had instead fallen into a catatonic state induced by the chemicals and preparations he had been using. This would explain why he appeared to be dead to his contemporaries, while actually remaining alive in the sealed burial chamber. The sounds heard by witnesses 30 years later would then have been the result of Cornelius awakening from his prolonged unconsciousness and desperately trying to escape from his tomb. This explanation was supported by the physical evidence of the scratch marks and the bone damage, which suggested that someone had indeed been alive and struggling inside the burial chamber. The timing of the awakening, exactly 30 years after the burial, could be explained by the gradual breakdown of the preservative chemicals Durst, or by changes in the burial environment that had allowed Cornelius to regain consciousness. The horror of this scenario was almost unbearable to contemplate. A man who had planned his own resurrection, awakening after 30 years of unconsciousness to find himself trapped in a sealed stone chamber with no way to escape and no one to hear his desperate pleas for help. The scratches on the walls told the story of his final hours, clawing frantically at the stone until his strength gave out and he died the death he had tried so hard to avoid. Dr. Kane's research into the Cornelius Blackwood case became the centerpiece of her book about colonial burial practices, but the psychological impact of the investigation stayed with her long after the book was published. She had spent months immersed in the story of a man whose obsession with death had led him to experience the most horrific death imaginable, and the knowledge of his suffering had affected her deeply. The case also had a profound impact on the Thornfield community, forcing residents to confront a dark chapter in their town's history that had been largely forgotten or ignored. The Blackwood family descendants struggled with the revelation that their ancestor had been involved in such disturbing activities, and some family members questioned whether the story should have been made public at all. Dr. Kane's work on the Cornelius Blackwood case established her reputation as a leading expert on unusual historical cases, but it also marked the end of her research into colonial burial practices. She found that she could no longer examine historical documents about death and burial without thinking about Cornelius's desperate final hours in his stone tomb, and she eventually shifted her research focus to less disturbing aspects of colonial history. The site where Cornelius's barn had stood remained empty and avoided by local residents who reported feeling uncomfortable when passing the area and claimed to hear strange sounds on quiet nights. The town eventually purchased the property and converted it into a small park, but visitors often reported feeling uneasy there, and the park was rarely used despite its convenient location. Dr. Kane thought the past was dead until she learned about the camp that should have been safe, where 3 innocent children would face a horror that would close their summer sanctuary forever and leave scars that would never heal. Let's move to our 11th and final story. Camp Scott, Oklahoma was supposed to be a place where childhood dreams came true, where young Girl Scouts could experience the magic of summer camp, surrounded by the rolling hills and dense forests of the Cooks and Hills. Established in 1928, the camp had hosted thousands of girls over the decades, creating memories of campfires, friendship bracelets, and the kind of innocent adventures that define the best parts of growing up. It was here that 5-year-old Linda Foster, a camp counselor with dreams of becoming a teacher, would witness an evil so profound that it would close Camp Scott forever and haunt everyone who survived that terrible summer. Linda had been working at Camp Scott for 3 summers, drawn back each year by her love of working with children and her belief in the camp's mission of building confidence and independence in young girls. She was responsible for overseeing the youngest campers, girls aged 8 to 10, who were experiencing their first taste of independence away from home. Linda took her responsibilities seriously, knowing that for many of these children, camp would be their first major experience away from their families. The summer of 1977 began like any other at Camp Scott, for 140 girls had enrolled for the various sessions, and the camp was buzzing with the excitement that always accompanied the start of summer activities. The facilities included multiple sleeping tents arranged in units throughout the wooded property, a dining hall, craft buildings, and recreational areas that provided everything needed for a traditional summer camp experience. Linda was assigned to Unit 8, which housed some of the youngest campers in the Kia unit. The girls in her care were full of enthusiasm for their camp adventure, chattering excitedly about the activities they wanted to try and the friends they hoped to make. Among the campers were 3 8-year-old girls who had become fast friends during their first few days at camp. Lori Lee Farmer from Tulsa, Michelle Heather Goose from Broken Arrow, and Doris Denise Milner from Tulsa. The 3 girls were typical of the children Linda loved working with, bright, curious, and eager to experience everything camp had to offer. Lori was the natural leader of the group, confident and outgoing with a smile that lit up her entire face. Michelle was quieter, but equally enthusiastic, with a gentle nature that made her popular with both campers and counselors. Denise was the comedian of the trio, always ready with a joke or a funny observation that kept her friends laughing. The first week of camp proceeded normally with the girls, participating in swimming lessons, arts and crafts, nature walks, and the traditional camp activities that had been part of the Camp Scott experience for decades. Linda noticed how well the 3 friends got along, how they looked out for each other during activities, and how they had formed the kind of close bond that often develops between children sharing their first major adventure away from home. On the evening of June 12, 1977, Linda was settling her campers into their sleeping bags in tent number 7 when she heard some of the girls whispering about strange sounds they had heard the night before. Several campers mentioned hearing what sounded like moaning or crying coming from the woods surrounding their unit, sounds that had frightened them, but that they had been too scared to report to the counselors. Linda reassured the girls that the sounds were probably just wildlife, owls, coyotes, or other nocturnal animals that were common in the Oklahoma woods. She reminded them that they were safe in their tents and that she and the other counselors were nearby if they needed anything. But privately, Linda felt a flutter of unease about the reports especially since several girls had mentioned hearing similar sounds on different nights. That night, Linda made extra rounds through the unit, checking on her campers and listening for any unusual sounds that might explain what the girls had heard. The camp was quiet, except for the normal sounds of summer night, crickets, the distant hoot of an owl, and the soft breathing of sleeping children. Linda convinced herself that the girls had simply been letting their imaginations run wild, as children often do when sleeping in an unfamiliar environment. The horror began in the early morning hours of June 13th, when Linda was awakened by screaming from one of the other counselors. She rushed outside to find chaos and panic as staff members discovered that tent number 7 was empty. Lori, Michelle, and Denise were missing from their sleeping bags with no sign of where they had gone or what had happened to them. The initial search focused on the possibility that the girls had wandered off on their own, perhaps to use the bathroom facilities or to explore the campgrounds. But as the search expanded and the present missing girls weren't found in any of the obvious locations, it became clear that something far more serious had occurred. The camp director contacted local law enforcement, and within hours, Camp Scott was swarming with police officers, search dogs, and volunteers from the surrounding community. The discovery came later that morning, when searchers found the bodies of all 3 girls in a wooded area, approximately 150 yards from their tent. The children had been sexually assaulted and murdered. Their young lives ended with a brutality that seemed impossible, in a place dedicated to childhood innocence and joy. The crime scene was so horrific that even experienced law enforcement officers were shaken by what they found. Linda's world collapsed when she learned what had happened to the 3 little girls who had been under her protection, the children she had tucked into their sleeping bags just hours earlier, the girls who had been giggling about camp activities and planning their next days. Adventures had been taken from their tent and subjected to unimaginable horror before being killed and discarded in the woods like trash. The investigation that followed was massive and complex, involving local police, state investigators, and FBI agents who descended on the small Oklahoma community. The crime scene evidence suggested that the perpetrator had been watching the camp for some time, learning the routines and identifying vulnerable targets. The killer had entered tent number 7 in the middle of the night, somehow removing 3 sleeping children without waking the other campers in the tent or alerting the counselors in nearby tents. The psychological impact on the surviving campers was devastating. Children who had come to camp excited about independence and adventure were suddenly confronted with the reality that evil could reach them even in places that were supposed to be safe. Many of the girls were traumatized by the knowledge that their friends had been taken from the tent next to theirs, and several required extensive counseling to deal with the trauma of the experience. Linda blamed herself for what had happened, tormented by the thought that she should have done something differently, should have taken the reports of strange sounds more seriously, should have been more vigilant in protecting the children under her care. The rationale part of her mind knew that she couldn't have prevented what happened, but the emotional weight of losing 3 children she was responsible for protecting was almost unbearable. The investigation eventually focused on Gene Leroy Hart, a local man with a history of violent crimes who had escaped from prison and was believed to be hiding in the area around Camp Scott. Hart was familiar with the local terrain and had the skills necessary to move through the woods undetected. He was captured and charged with the murders, but he was acquitted at trial despite evidence linking him to the crimes. Hart died in prison in 1979 while serving time for other offenses, taking whatever secrets he might have had about the Camp Scott murders to his grave. The case was officially closed, but many people involved in the investigation remained convinced that questions about the murders had never been fully answered. Camp Scott closed permanently after the murders, unable to continue operating in the shadow of such a horrific crime. The property was eventually sold, and the buildings were demolished. But the memory of what happened there continued to haunt everyone who had been touched by the tragedy. The camp that had been a place of joy and discovery for thousands of girls over nearly 50 years was forever associated with the loss of 3 innocent children. Linda never worked with children again after the Camp Scott murders. The trauma of losing Lori, Michelle, and Denise under her watch destroyed her confidence and her ability to take responsibility for other people's children. She left Oklahoma shortly after the trial and moved to a different state where she found work in an office environment that allowed her to avoid the constant reminders of what had happened. The families of the 3 murdered girls were left to grieve not only the loss of their children, but also the destruction of their faith in the safety of institutions designed to protect and nurture young people. The murders had shown them that evil could strike anywhere, even in the most innocent and protected environments, and that no place was truly safe from those who would harm children. The Camp Scott murders became one of Oklahoma's most notorious unsolved crimes, a case that highlighted the vulnerability of children and the devastating impact that violence can have on entire communities. The case also demonstrated the lasting trauma that such crimes inflict not only on the immediate victims, but on everyone who was connected to them. The other campers, the counselors, the families, and the community members who had trusted in the safety of the camp environment. The investigation revealed serious security deficiencies at Camp Scott, including inadequate lighting, insufficient supervision, and a lack of proper background checks for staff and volunteers. These revelations led to changes in how summer camps across the country approached security and child protection. But they came too late to save Lori, Michelle, and Denise. Linda carried the memory of those 3 little girls with her for the rest of her life, never forgetting their faces or their excitement about their camp adventure. She often wondered what they might have become if they had been allowed to grow up, what contributions they might have made to the world, and what joy they might have brought to their families and communities. The empty lot where Camp Scott once stood serves as a silent memorial to the 3 girls who died there and to the innocence that was lost on that terrible night in June 1977. Local residents still avoid the area, and those who knew the camp in its heyday speak of it only in whispers, remembering both the joy it once brought and the horror that ended it all. Trust your instincts. If something feels wrong, it probably is. Don't let politeness or the fear of seeming paranoid prevent you from protecting yourself and your loved ones. Check on your neighbors. Believe survivors when they speak out, and never assume that tragedy only happens to other people in other places. Subscribe to Verified Fears and hit that notification bell, because in a world where these stories are real, staying informed might just save your life. Share these stories with someone you care about, because awareness is the first line of defense against becoming the next victim. Stay safe, stay vigilant, and remember, the most dangerous monsters are often the ones who look just like